Hello and welcome to the Representation Project's In Rape Campaign Expert Interview Series. I'm Dr. Caroline Heldman, the Executive Director of the Representation Project. And as you probably know, it was founded by Jennifer Siebel Newsom more than a decade ago to talk about how rigid gender roles harm everyone. Her film Misrepresentation started a national conversation about sexism in media. And her second film, The Mask You Live in 2015, started another national conversation about masculinity, which completely shifted the vernacular that we use around that subject. She's tackled a lot of very important subjects pertaining to gender justice. And today we are diving into the causes and consequences of sexual violence in an incredible series of interviews. Just a quick moment to say that this will be a triggering interview. It will likely activate you if you are a survivor who is experiencing activation and triggering. So just want to let you know, we're also going to be showing a video that will be especially impactful. So perhaps you might want to drop off and then watch the recording and take it at your own pace, but obviously up to you. So with no further ado, I am so honored to be interviewing Lenora Claire today. She is the foremost expert on stalking in the United States, and I want to read her long bio and immediately jump into some questions. I know she has so much information to share, and I would say stalking, it's a form of gender-based violence. And it's not well understood. So we are so lucky to have Lenora really reveal the myths and the facts with us today. So Lenora Claire is a survivor of multiple violent crimes. She is an advocate, an activist, an entertainment industry professional, and a founding member of the Los Angeles District Attorney's Crime Victims Advisory Board and a native Angelino. After becoming the fixation of a dangerous stalker, Lenora began to speak out not only for herself, but for the other 13 million Americans currently being stalked who find themselves without resources and often living in fear. Lenora has been called the Erin Brockovich of stalking by Vice for her legislative proposals with Congressman Adam Schiff. And her story went viral. She began working with victims who needed help navigating the complex worlds of law enforcement and the judicial system. And she has helped countless people obtain restraining orders. She has served as a human shield in court, and she has lectured on the subject of risk minimization at schools and, of course, on podcasts and television shows. You may recognize her face. You likely recognize her name. After her case was featured on 48 Hours and Dr. Oz and Crime Watch Daily, CBS News, and a number of other major media outlets, Lenora began to realize that despite the attention it was receiving and the mountains of credible threats, law enforcement officials are still really unable to provide the rapid intervention that is required. It was then that Lenora took measures to capture her stalker herself, leading to his successful conviction in 2018, and we'll be talking about that. As the public face of stalking in America, Lenora began helping other victims of related crimes, including sexual assault, domestic violence, revenge porn, and cyber harassment, which led her to meet fellow advocate Jess Gilbert. And Jess is amazing and incredible, and with us today, sharing similar progressive views regarding inclusiveness for all who have been victimized. The duo formed the Innovative Justice Alliance to propose legislation and develop methods of prevention in the technology space. Lenora also works as a consultant on television and in film production, advocating for victims and their families to ensure respectful depictions of their most traumatic and vulnerable moments. Welcome, Lenora.
Gosh, thanks so much for having me. And that was quite a mouthful, and having lived it, I'm still like, I can't believe all this happened. But I always want to start off by saying I really recognize my privilege in having this platform, because so many survivors do not have that ability. So I hope that I can honor them by being twice as loud for them. So I always just take a moment to recognize that. But yes, thank you. Thank you for having me, and all of you for attending.
I love that introduction saying, look, there are a lot of us who are silenced, whose experiences will never be shared and never be brought to light. There will be no justice, which is a great segue too into the first question. It's a personal question. So let's start off, as much as you're comfortable, telling us about your stalking experience and how you came to be essentially the face of stalking in the US.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to tell my story, but I think for maximum impact, I'd really like to start with the video, because to understand the sort of everything that I've gone through, you really have to understand the perpetrator. And when I say I was being ignored, when you understand the level of what was being ignored, it just resonates so much more. So if we go ahead and get that, and again, this is incredibly triggering and upsetting. So just like she had said earlier, if this is too much, you may want to take a moment outside.
And this is your stalker for
This is
context.
my stalker, correct?
Yes, I absolutely would hurt people with no qualms and no apologies. I can kill people with my bare hands. You kidding me? Or I'm an extremely fucking dangerous person. I'm Jesus Christ. I'm a god and I have real divine powers. And yes, I will fucking take the law into my own hands.
Does Lenora Claire have a reason to be afraid of you?
You're damn right I'm a scary fucking person. I terrify the fucking shit out of people. Yeah, a lot of restraining orders are not legal, though. It is morally justified and legal to break that law.
Lenora Claire wants you to stop sending her stuff. Right.
She's part of the Zionist networks. And they got all these girls that have me fucking framed out to be crazy when I'm really the Messiah. People need to learn that I don't have a lot of respect for fear. Lenora Claire's story is basically all lies. When she said there were rape threats, that was a parody film concept I sent her. If Lenora Claire is going to be a Zionist, a part of like a Zionist conspiracy, then we've got to find a way to get her out of social power. Can't have like women like that fucking up our social matrix. Like, man up a little bit, you know? Those restraining orders aren't legal. I will not stop sending them. I will use the power of God to fucking destroy anyone who opposes me. I will not stop, and I will fucking destroy you. So try stopping me. You die. I will kill them all. They will die. You will not stop me from sending messages. And if you try, you will die. I will not stop sending emails. To Lenora Claire, I will kill you. I will destroy you.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. I think that really kind of sets the tone before I get into my story so that we can have a face to everything I'm going to explain. Whew, a little deep breath there.
Yeah.
So my story in regards to stalking started back in 2011. I was living a really different life than I live now. I had opened up an art gallery. I'd worked so hard for it. I was incredibly proud. And the local paper, the LA Weekly, they did a feature on me. It was one of the people of the year. It was like a really wonderful time. And what I didn't know was my stalker, whose real name is Justin Massler, but he goes by Cloud Star Chaser. So I might go between both names. He was already convicted of stalking Ivanka Trump out in New York. Again, this is 2011 Ivanka Trump, also a different time for her too. I don't know any of this. I'm living my life out in LA. So he jumps bail and comes to Los Angeles, and he picks up the LA Weekly where he sees this photograph of me, and he starts to become fixated. He comes to my gallery and he's wearing like a spacesuit. And especially when you work in the arts, you're used to kind of like fun, creative, quirky types. So it doesn't seem so unusual. So I went up to him and I engaged with him. We had some conversation, and he looked me right in the eye and he said, "You look like Jessica Rabbit." I was like, okay, I hear that sometimes because of my hair. Thanks, whatever. And they started kind of, just saying some things that felt really unhinged and made me uncomfortable. So I was getting ready to remove him from the gallery. And he said, "You look Jessica Rabbit." And he looked me right in the eyes. And he said, "And I'm going to stalk you." Excuse, like what? I was like, let me just get this strange man out of here. So I kicked him out. I thought this was all over. A couple days later, I start getting texts from my friends who had seen in various like news sources and blogs that the Trumps had hired bounty hunters to extradite him back to New York to stay on trial. So he's in Rikers Island. And that's when I start getting just this like barrage of, at first they were really kind of rambling, nonsensical letters where, they were disturbing, but they weren't outright threats. And so I actually felt really sorry for him. I was like this person. And I always want to say that I'm not stigmatizing the mentally ill. That's the last thing that I want to do. And not all schizophrenics are dangerous. It's just, that is part of this individual's story, and he is dangerous. So we'll just have that there. So I start getting these ramblings, and where things shifted was it pretty quickly went to incredibly graphic, horrific rape, death threats, kidnapping threats. And it was absolutely terrifying. And as soon as he was released, because it was only a misdemeanor in New York, so he didn't serve much time on that. So he got out, and then I started getting like these, because he's schizoaffective actually. So it's schizophrenic and bipolar. So the mania would set in, and I would be getting like hundreds of emails a day. And again, these are just the most horrific, really detailed threats. So I went to LAPD Northeast Division with this like mountain of rape and death threats. And I was just like, this person has a criminal history. Can you help me? And They looked me in the eye and they told me to dye my hair and get off the internet. That was their solution for me. So I ended up closing my art gallery, which is another thing people don't realize. So often when you're being stalked, there's, impact on, it starts to infiltrate all parts of your life, whether it's the personal life, your work life, and job loss is a large factor. So this gallery that I'd worked so hard to achieve, I actually closed it for my own safety because I couldn't have a public facing job where I was showing up there every day. And that's what got me working in television, because I could be in an office. It felt safer for me. So I'm getting these rape threats, death threats, police aren't doing anything for me. And now at this point, I start working in reality casting. So I can't get off the internet because part of why I'm being hired is my social media outreach to cast these shows. So I started having to go, okay, I have to do what I have to do to be safe myself. I started learning risk minimization, like how to track IP, because my stalker comes from a wealthy family. And so he was able to just kind of crisscross the country. So I would track the IP to know where he was that day and then kind of understand my level of risk. So I'm getting these threats. It's just constant. I don't want to say I normalized it, but at some point, you have to keep going and just do as much as you can for yourself. And then my stalker sent a death threat to my boss. And I don't know about your audience, but for me, there's something where it's one thing if you're doing something to me, but if you start to do something to somebody that cares, that's when you really start to activate. And so I realized at this point that it would have been easy for me to obtain a restraining order. It wasn't that I was being denied that. It was because he didn't have a fixed address. I was unable to serve him. And a lot of people don't realize that. So one of the conversations I'm always having is, if you can send me a death threat via email, why can't I send you a restraining order via email? We have precedent for all kinds of things that kind of work out that way. So anyway, so I'm living this life. I'm getting these awful threats. I'm so terrified. The level of anxiety and hypervigilance and the health problems I was starting to have when all this is going on. It's another thing we don't really have a lot of conversation about that we need to. I was getting stomach ulcers. My hair was falling out. And so I decided that I was going to go public with my story, because I was living at that time in a really small studio apartment that really anybody could have broken into. My father was dead. I didn't have anywhere to go. And it was really a stressful situation. So I started telling my story. And again, I went public in 2015. So this is prior to Me Too, when the climate was really different. Not that it's always so welcoming and wonderful now, as we would hope it would be, but it was really different back then. And the more I would try to tell my story, the more I was victim blamed and shamed. I was told to dress how I want to be addressed. And that was also a really difficult experience, but I was so scared. I really didn't know what else to do. So I was finally able to serve my first restraining order, because I had one pending in the computer, and my stalker had gone to a woman that he had gone to high school with. And he went to the front desk of her office and he said, "I'm here to rape so-and-so." And the police came, detained him. And so luckily I was able to serve my first restraining order. And at that point, I really thought okay, we have a restraining order. Now, when these things happen, they're going to move on them. No, and we'll get to that part of my story. I actually had over 4,000 violations of my restraining order, all of which should have been acted upon, because there's the law and the enforcement of the law, which is a whole other conversation. So now at this point, I'm telling my story in the media. I want to say around 2017 was when Vice did an article on me where they called me the Erin Brockovich of stalking, which is so much to live up to. But people started coming to me for help, right? And so I started helping people, as you mentioned, I've done over 100 restraining orders, doing court support. And I started realizing, oh my God, nobody is serving these people that are having this crime happening, because, and we'll get into the stats in a little bit. It's kind of 50-50 with, so I'll give some stalking stats to just sort of set the tone. So we used to go off these old stats from 2013, where it was 7.5 million Americans. Again, super underreported. It was always more. We got these new stats this year where it's now 13.5. So we've more than doubled. And again, super underreported. It's way more than that. And the reflection of what we're seeing is it's about 45% former intimate partner, right? Which is like a DV overlap. Then there's 40%, which is acquaintance stalking. And then there's stranger and public figure. So it used to be 90-10. It used to be 90% domestic violence, 10% strangers. So we have the internet to thank, because it's creating these kind of parasocial relationships where people, if maybe they were kind of bent that way, now they know your dog's name, they know where you like to go to dinner, and they form these unhealthy relationships with you. Sorry, diving back into my story. So now, even though I'm helping other people because I'm trying to make meaning of what's happening to me and just trying to do something, but I'm still, no one's protecting me. I'm still getting the death threats, the rape threats daily. I'm still terrified. It is not a good time for me. So what ended up happening was in 2017, I got an email from my stalker saying that he knows that I like to go to LA Comic-Con, and that's where he's going to come kidnap me so that we can be together and we can go fight ISIS together. That was what the email said. And my stalker didn't know that I actually knew the owners of LA Comic-Con. So the kids are always safe. They're amazing, but I worked with them. Again, LAPD was not helping me. And my case was actually elevated to something called the Threat Management Unit, which is an elite division of the LAPD that's supposed to help celebrities. And I'm sort of like, well, celebrities have access to all kinds of things regular people don't. But even though my case was there, nobody was arresting him. Nobody's helping me. So when he told me he was going to come kidnap me from LA Comic-Con, I worked with LA Comic-Con. We hired security. We dressed them up as Batman and Superman as to not scare the children. So when he came to kidnap me, which is exactly what happened, they held him down. And we were able to hold him until LAPD got there, arrested him, and he went in. And then shortly after, I know he was stalking the Kardashians as well. They served him with a restraining order, and there was some incident with Gwyneth Paltrow and her children. I'm still unclear as to what happened. So this is a person who's stalking a lot of people, but it's just the regular person without the security team who had to do the thing to get to this. So about a year later, we were supposed to have my trial, but what ended up happening is there was a plea deal that was done. And I found out literally walking up the courthouse steps, you're all ready for this thing. And that's how it played out. And he was sentenced to felony max, which in California is supposed to be a 4-year sentence. But there was a proposition, which is really complicated. And I understand why people voted for it. And I probably would have too, if I didn't have an understanding. Prop 57. And Prop 57 is supposed to have nonviolent offenses get reduced sentencing, which is great. However, in California, crimes, including stalking, are considered nonviolent, as well as human trafficking, forced sodomy, and rape of a conscious person. So my 4-year sentence was immediately reduced to 2. He served 2 years for stalking me, and within 3 days was reoffending. He was stalking me again. They had an ankle monitor on him, and ankle monitors are also really complicated because Department of Corrections does not check them very often. So that's a whole other conversation. I've had to put my stalker in jail, I think 5 times now. I've lost track. And so I just leaned heavy into the activism, and I was just like, this is crazy what this has done to my life, what this has done to my health, to my family, to my loved ones. Oh yeah, he tried to kidnap my dog. There's a lot that happened. And again, there's so much to get into. I'm not trying to center myself in the story, but people always say to me, I'm so sorry this happened. And I'm always like, it's not a past tense. It is still ongoing. It is still happening. Yep. I've just taught myself all the things that I can do to protect myself. But this is definitely an ongoing situation.
Ooh. Okay. So can I just ask a personal question about, you said you don't get used to it, but how are you mentally and emotionally managing this?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And the answer is I have good days and bad days. There's some days where I'm feeling really positive about things, and other days where I'm just completely terrified, or he's contacted somebody and I'm like, oh my God, I've been through all of this. Like when I say, like, when people go justice, like I got the thing most never get, and I'm still in this position. So it's really day by day. But as far as like my functionality, I just, I always compare it to a condom, right? If you use a condom or a seatbelt, you're doing all the things to protect yourself, right? And so I do all the risk minimization I can to be safe, and that's about as good as it gets. And I just have to kind of live my life.
Yeah. So you and I have had this conversation. I have 3 very serious stalkers from many years back. 2 of them are watching right now. They're constantly infiltrating whatever I'm doing. And you had brought up the fact that, these are strangers. I've never met them, but they're engaging in daily contact, and some of it's threatening, most of it's not. It's mostly amorous, right? That's a very unusual type of stalking. You had brought up the different types. Can you tell us more, like, what is the definition of stalking, Lenora, and what are the most common types?
Sure. So I always would say, every time I explain the definition, there's always somebody who hears it and goes, oh my God, that's me. So I already know that's going to happen. So the definition in most states is more or less 2 or more unwanted attempts at contact that make a reasonable, and I'm using quotes for reasonable person fear for their safety. The reason why I make the quotes of reasonable is because I've seen it being weaponized, where sometimes law enforcement says you're being unreasonable because they haven't been trained to do a real assessment on your case. and they don't have the knowledge where, for example, you might say, well, my ex-partner has a lot of guns, or, so they go, oh my God, you're acting crazy, but that is the definition. It's 2 or more unwanted attempts at contact that make a reasonable person fear for their safety.
And it's mostly somebody either intimately or at least
Or acquaintance, correct. But you and I have this sort of smaller category, which is a stranger or with public figure, even though we may not be massively, but it's still a stranger who saw us in a thing and then became fixated. So it's more similar to that. Although from the reporting, you would think it was all celebrities, right? You would think that 13.5 million people being stalked were all Kardashians, and obviously that's just not the case.
Well, tell us a little bit more about the profile of a stalker. Is there a profile?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I always want to sort of clarify that much like victim survivors can be anybody, the perpetrators can be as well. However, if we're just going off the stats, it's largely male, it's largely a former partner, and they're between the ages of 30 and 40.
Okay. And this is just for my own benefit. I am curious, do stalkers know they're stalkers?
I mean, and I always want to be careful with the mental health component, right? That depends. Like ones who are schizophrenic, they may like mine has erotomania and he believes we're married, right? So he doesn't see, sometimes he does use that language, but right? And then there's others who are more in the sort of personality disorder space, right? And they're not seeing it that way. And I always, again, I'm going to say something which is not qualified by any study. It's purely anecdotal, but I've talked to hundreds, if not thousands of survivors. So this is a pattern that I'm seeing when we're talking about the perpetrators. I always call it my extra sparkly theory, which the reason why I call it this is that in working with survivors, so frequently I have these like amazing relationships. These are all really fascinating, charismatic, just cool people. And I started making these friendships and wondering, is it because we're bound by our trauma? Is that when I was like, no. It's not because we're bound by our trauma. It's because these are really wonderful people, just delightful. It's, they make jokes about it on true crime shows, like memes about it, like, oh, so-and-so lit up the room, right? But that is a thing. That's why I call it the extra sparkly. And this sort of, again, this is purely anecdotal, but I believe these perpetrators, they want to obtain, possess, and control, all of which they are not, because they are not anything. And so they gravitate to these people, right, who are just delightful people, and they want to obtain, possess, and control them. I see that over and over again. So, again, I don't know how you would study that, but that is something that I see all the time.
Well, and that's a great segue. You're talking about mental health issues. Great segue into the recent Supreme Court decision out of Colorado regarding stalking that essentially gutted our stalking laws, and it got overshadowed by a number of other very important cases, the overturning of affirmative action, student loans, et cetera. Can you tell us about the Supreme Court case and where it leaves victims?
Yeah. So a couple things before I get into anything legal, I always say, I'm not a lawyer. I'm married to one, but just like my dad was a doctor, I'm not going to operate on you. However, I have met with prosecutors and lawyers and Spark, who's the DOJ funded stalking awareness and education work. So I really met with everybody and got a broad opinion and a better understanding, because the Supreme Court ruling is incredibly complicated, especially for a non-lawyer when you're really going through it. So I kind of want to break it down into 2 different things first. First, I want to break it down into the optics and the reporting. I also want to say it wasn't like things were so great before this ruling. It wasn't like we were protected and everybody was getting restraining orders and convictions and we were safe. So that's just not true. Okay, so with this ruling, which is really more about free speech and intent than it is stalking, if that makes sense. They kind of yes, they overlap, but with stalking, there's a lot of other crimes that can go into it, like trespassing and other things. So it isn't like because of this ruling, you've got no chance for conviction, but let's do the optics first. The first thing with the reporting is exactly like what you said, like here's a devastating blow. I mean, my phone was blowing up off the hook. My friend Anna, who's a stalking survivor, she even told The Guardian she vomited in her car. These are very visceral reactions. And the reason why we're having these reactions is because we're coming from, an expectation that we're going to be failed once again. We've been failed so frequently by law enforcement, the judicial system. Why wouldn't Supreme Court, a Supreme Court with known abusers on it who are trying to take away our autonomy, why wouldn't they make a bad decision? So we're already feeling that before anything even happened. The anxiety in my community was already high. So you have this reporting that feels like this is it. So this is what I feel is going to happen. I feel you're going to have even less people coming forward because they're just afraid to. You're going to have law enforcement who are really not properly trained to understand all the nuance of stalking. It's very similar to if you had a medical condition and you went to like a general practitioner when you need to see a specialist, right? These officers, it's not even their fault. They're not really trained. So they're going to do what they already kind of do sometimes and just say, well, our hands are tied, right? So you're going to have that. So you're not even going to get as far as prosecution because you're not going to get to where they're even filing it, right? So you've got all these steps. I do think that it is going to make restraining orders more difficult because a lot of times you'll get restraining orders when the threats are present before the violence has occurred. So there may be difficulty there. All these things are hugely problematic and deeply upsetting, and they all have to be addressed. As far as the actual ruling, the weird thing is, I want to say, and I could be wrong, I think as high as 80% of the states already kind of had similar language. So it's kind of just making it more uniform. So it's not as bad as it could have been, but really everything, even the judges who chose to dissent, are weird. The whole thing is weird. The case that they chose is weird. It's not great, but this is, again, if you are being stalked, you likely have other crimes. And for example, the biggest other fear that I have is when you have a deluded stalker like mine, the argument, right, and that is who is the most dangerous. So if it's all about intent, then you're running into some issues there. So
yeah, I mean, essentially, the greater your mental health issues and the less tethered you are to reality, the more you are protected because your intent maybe isn't there.
correct. That's what we're thinking, but we'll see how it plays out. You know, it's still too early to know. But yeah, I mean, again, the part that makes me just go, well, is again, the language with threat codes. It was already kind of similar to this, like in California. It doesn't really actually change anything in California. I met with Rhonda Saunders, who was the ADA in 1992 when this law was, she actually was very instrumental in creating the California stalking laws. And she said, don't worry, this isn't really any different for us. We're kind of where we are. So that made me breathe a little bit easier. But again, it's the impact of all the other things that's so deeply concerning for me.
Absolutely. And that's another great segue to the next question, which is about what we need to do. So you have a magic wand. What do you change about law enforcement, the justice system, so that stalking victims are actually protected?
Oh God, a magic wand is sounds so amazing. I think the first thing, as with most issues, is education and prevention, right? Like that is a massive component. I always say that stalking is very much like sexual assault in the 70s, as far as our lack of understanding, either in the culture. So we need to get that out there. I'd also really like to see serious training with law enforcement, because that is that's your barrier. Again, I feel weird saying justice, but your barrier to all of that, right? And again, it's not their fault they don't have training. And what I'd really love to see is funding for forensic psychologists who could kind of, be on site maybe once a week. They'd be able to evaluate the threats and be able to red flag who's the most at risk and be able to put resources towards them. I think that would be incredibly valuable. I've been advocating for something, and whether it's bringing it up to George Gascon here in LA, because that's our DA, but literally anyone who will listen to me. I've had this idea, because if we're and again, a lot of states are moving away from incarceration. And so if we're going to do that, we have to do something to protect people. We can't just leave them hanging in the wind. So I have an idea. It's sort of based off of geofencing and geotracking that we have on our phone. And it came from when my stalker had the ankle monitor on, and I realized Department of Corrections wasn't doing anything. They weren't monitoring it. So why can't I have an app in my phone, if say my restraining order is 1,000 feet, whatever it is, that's connected to the ankle monitor, that would give me an alert letting them know that they're in my proximity. So there's things like that I'd really love to see, especially when you're being stalked so often, technology is being used against you. And I think there's a lot of ways we can implement technology to help protect us.
Yes, and obviously major civil rights and civil liberties questions there about what is the use of technology if someone has been convicted and truly poses a threat.
Right.
So last question before we open it up, and I know we already have questions rolling in, and it's going to be a really vibrant last half of this session, just addressing questions. But let's say someone is in an active stalking situation, they're sitting in front of you. What advice do you give them?
Yeah. So one of the first things that I always tell people is a lot of times when people are finding themselves in this position, they go to well-intentioned friends who maybe aren't the most informed, and their friend will just say, don't worry, just block the person, just block the person. And really that's appropriate for harassment. If someone's just being nasty to you, when you're being stalked, not only do you need to be able to assess the level of threat that you're under. I mean, use my example. If I had blocked my stalker, I wouldn't know that he intended to kidnap me and be able to stop that. Not to mention you're gathering evidence. That's such a huge, if you don't have evidence, you don't have anything. So that's the first thing I tell people is you really want to kind of gray rock it. Don't interact with them. That's because it's not going to go well. If you're nice to them, they glom on harder. If you're aggressive, it exacerbates the situation. So no contact. But just let the sort of, because again, you can see if there's 100 coming in a day, then you can go, okay, they're super unhinged right now. I'm super right. So that's a really important thing. Also, we don't really think about how much of our personal information is on the internet. So I always advise people, there's places you can do it yourself, or there's places like Delete Me where you pay a fee and because all of our addresses are the cars we're leasing. It's all on the internet. So you want to wipe all of that. And then there's just some sort of, good sense practice for, switching up your schedule. If you go to yoga class, switch it up, take different patterns from home. I'm also not a fan of parking spaces with your name on it at work. I think that's really dangerous. I've seen people who get trackers under their car. I mean, there's just a lot of stuff like that. And I definitely tailor things to the individual, but yes, definitely those are like the three things. Also, even though there can be a sense of stigma or shame around it, you really need to tell people around you because, it's to see something, say something, you need eyes on you, tell the people that you work with, tell your loved ones, your neighbors, my neighbors know my situation. And that's, I think, to help protect me.
Yeah. Oh, great advice. And I will say that first piece, everyone gives that advice. They say, oh, just block them, not understanding it. Well, first off, it doesn't matter if you block them, they'll find other ways. But
Right.
Secondly, it's such a rich source of information about where they are, how they're feeling, whether the level of threat. It's just really important to actually be monitoring what's coming from them in order to read those tea leaves. Okay, we have some fantastic questions. Anonymous asks, is learning how to track IP something that anyone can do? Can you recommend any resources?
Yeah, I mean, I learned how to do it from Google. Like, I'm not some tech person. You can ask my husband. I always make him like program the remote. I'm not a tech genius, right? It's easier from Google. There used to be like a little pull down menu. It depends on which email that you have. And also people can mask it. I was lucky that my stalker does not have that capability. That's a tricky thing. But yes, some emails you can track IP pretty easily, unless they know how not to.
Yes. Well, we're not going to recommend anything on the dark web, but talking about people getting information, they can get anything.
They can get anything, yeah.
Anything. Ms. K asked, is he locked up in a mental institution? He's not someone who will take his meds?
Yeah, so that is right. He is currently, he's completely off, ankle monitors off, nothing. He violated recently and my case was pending at the DA's office. That's another thing too. Another thing that we may see with counterman, but we were already seeing before is that, and again, in California, I have to explain it, stalking is a wobbler. It could be a misdemeanor or a felony. It can go in either way, right? So with my case, this most recent violation, they decided that it didn't, even though to me, I'm like, it's already at a felony. I've already been prosecuted at a felony. Why is this not a further felony? But it was kicked down to the city attorney in misdemeanor, which we see a lot. And a lot of times what experts would consider to be stalking, it doesn't meet the threshold or they don't go for it. And it's like aggravated nuisance or some other like lesser misdemeanor where it really doesn't do anything.
Yeah. Okay. I think what's mind-blowing about this is that kind of like other forms of gender-based violence, domestic violence, sexual violence, a lot of overlap, of course, between these categories. We just assume that we as a society take it seriously, or if you haven't interacted with the system, we just assume that something as egregious and obvious and with so much evidence would be addressed as though it's a real threat because he obviously is a threat. And it doesn't matter, right? Like, I think it's mind-blowing because people think the system works a certain way, and for gender-based violence, it absolutely does not. I don't know if you want to say anything further on that, but
I will. Just even using my case as an example, very early on, before I had even gotten my restraining order, when I walked into LAPD with my mountain of death and rape threats, I pulled up a New York Post article because my stalker had tried to kill himself in Ivanka Trump's store. And I was like, this person is dangerous. This person is workplace violence. He's threatening my boss. Like, can we not move? And they still had the like, dye your hair, get off the internet attitude.
Yep, which of course shifts the responsibility and essentially the blame for a felony crime to you.
It's always on us.
So you can control it.
Yeah.
Another anonymous attendee asks, what do you wish young people, especially ones that are chronically online, which I think is synonymous with young people, what do you wish they knew about their privacy and vulnerabilities using various apps? Are there any hard no's that parents should make when it comes to using certain social media apps?
Wow, as a non-parent, I have a hard time telling other parents what to do, but I mean, definitely instilling in your children the idea, you know, things like geotagging. There's so much information when you post a photo that they may not realize, right? And even just like, you know, kids, they love to, you know, I'm at the Beyonce concert or whatever, like that is not a great idea. So it's really just sort of just instilling good sense practice without, again, telling them you can enjoy the internet. We don't need to be restrictive, because what happens when you restrict too much, then they rebel and they don't tell you anything, and then it goes the full other way. But I definitely think, you know, explaining that there are predators out there and there's a way to use things responsibly. And, you know, I know if I had a kid, I'd be like, you could have all those things, just keep it on private, you know, like that would be what I would say if I had a kid. But
Talk with your friends. Yep. Don't make it public. Another anonymous attendee is asking, outside of training for law enforcement and prosecution, what can healthcare and healthcare professionals do to respond to stalking?
do you mean as far as on the survivor side, or do you mean?
I think so. They're not clarifying, but I'm
Sure.
assuming this question is similar to the recognition about a decade ago with the World Health Organization that healthcare workers are the front lines for folks who are experiencing domestic violence.
So I'll say one of the things that I'm really proud of here in LA County when I took the role on the board was we didn't have anybody at the Bureau of Victim Services. Like when my case first came in, I didn't know that I was eligible for things like California Victims Compensation and $5,000 worth of therapy because my case didn't fall under domestic violence, right? It was a stranger stalking. So nobody told me that I was able and eligible for all of these programs. So when I took this role at the DA's office, I was also able to inform policy. That's a whole other conversation. But I was able to advocate to get 15 stalking specific reps for the city of LA. So I would definitely, if it was a healthcare organization, I would say there's Spark, who are amazing, and they do these trainings, and they can come in and they can tell you. I mean, the training is so wonderful. Like literally more than I could ever articulate in this short window of time. But I would just say, reach out to Spark. They're paid for, they're federally paid for to come and do these trainings, to give this information to organizations. And they're so cool. And they just do really wonderful work. So I'd say reach out to them.
Okay, Spark, concrete resources. This is great. Erica says, hey, Lenora, it's Erica. Thank you again for your efforts and for hosting this conversation. How can we get people to understand that online harassment and stalking switches to the real world? Since you're familiar with my case, we filed reports in 3 different states, and each agency is saying they cannot help us because this is all online, but it's not all online. They're just behind the internet to commit most of their crimes.
Again, this goes back to the training. You know, there's the real world and the internet. It's all the same now. We don't like there is no separation of that. And that is why I know you're very involved with trying to get judges training about sexual assault, right? It's the same thing. It all comes back to the training and the education component. So again, I don't have the magic wand that we spoke of earlier to just be like, this is common sense, this internet real world here. But they absolutely do overlap, and it's insane to think otherwise.
Yeah, they do overlap. I don't know what the data is on that. Do you know the data on that? I will tell you, I've had many years of online, and then all of a sudden they show up in person. How often does that happen?
Really often. I'm sure Spark has a wonderful infographic if you go to their website. I'm not going to make up a fabricated number that I don't know, but I would say anecdotally it's very high. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry to put you on the
spot.
No,
it's okay. I remember most of the stats. for a lady with dyslexia, I do a great job remembering the stats. But I don't know that one.
You are the leading expert on this subject. So Heather asks, what are ideas for safety plan components when there are co-parenting or child visitation orders and arrangements, obviously with someone who's stalking you?
Right. There was that law that we just passed in California. It starts with a P. Do you know what I'm talking about? About parental visits. It was named after a boy who was killed by
parental alienation.
Is Peaky's law, PICQU? Because this is a problem. This is such a problem. And I will be really honest and say that I don't, even though that is a common component, maybe it's because I don't have kids. A lot of people that come to me don't have children. It's more the family court thing is a whole other thing. But hold on, I'm gonna have to look it up. It literally just got passed to protect during these exact situations. Like this just happened. Hold on. Sorry, caught me off guard, but this is a great question.
I'm Googling too, can't find
Yeah.
it.
And it's yeah, okay. Yeah, it was, yeah, it's called I'm pronouncing it wrong. It's PIQUI's law, and it affects custody hearings and child abuse and disputes, and it kind of handles this one. Yeah. Do you see it, what I'm pulling up?
Yep, it establishes new guidelines and rules for that.
Yes. So an expert who handles that would be probably more appropriate, but there are some things because it is such an issue. Absolutely.
Somebody is asking whether or not this will be recorded. It absolutely will be. You can share with friends, family, and others you think might benefit. There's a follow-up on the healthcare question, mainly for ER staff. I did have Anna come to my state to talk about sexual assault nurse examiners. So saying,
Are you talking about, I'm assuming Anna Nauset is probably who they're referring to, who's fabulous. Yeah. Yeah, she's great.
So what can ER staff, it's specifically ER staff, maybe you've already actually addressed that. It's, yeah.
As far as stalking?
Yes.
So I mean, a lot of times, you know, this is the first time somebody is really hearing us. So I would imagine if you're talking about like a sane nurse, I think a sane nurse would be wonderful to handle stalking as well. I mean, there is a lot of overlap there. So if you've had that specialty training, you would absolutely be appropriate to, you know, to handle this as well.
And sane nurses are fantastic at understanding contents, multiple types. And of course, we have our therapy kittens always for the end rape series because things get very heavy. Jessica is sharing the Spark website. Thank you for that. Oh, therapy puppy, therapy kitten. Julia says, thanks, Lenora. Spark is the Stalking Prevention Awareness and Resource Center, and our website where you can request training and resources is stalking awareness, www.stalkingawareness.org. And what we'll do is we'll post that below the video when this goes live. Lorene asks, I know Diana Freed at Cornell University is doing a lot of research on digital safety and dating violence. There's some great resources being shared here. We also have a few other questions going in different directions. Are there any, Anonymous asks, are there any statistics around people who are stalked and subsequently having contact offending by the stalker?
I'm sorry, repeat the question.
Are there any statistics around people who are stalked and subsequently, I think, have contact from the stalker again? Like what percentage?
Oh, it's so frequent that I mean, I don't know the exact, yeah, I mean, it's, almost always.
Yeah, I mean as you're pointing out, law enforcement or rules or guidelines are not actually stopping, the laws are not being enforced.
Exactly, it's the enforcement of law, I mean, look, some people get lucky, and I hate even saying getting lucky because their perpetrator moves on to somebody else. That's not lucky. It's now someone else's problem, but sometimes that does happen. But also like mine is, I lost track after the 40th person told me they had a restraining order against him. And yet he still finds his way back to me. He just kind of like ping pongs between people.
So some people are getting it worse at various times.
Yeah.
Anonymous asks, thank you so much for sharing your story. I had a brief stalking experience with an ex, and it consumed every part of my life for years. Couldn't sleep, didn't want any information out about me at all, etc. In other words, shifting their lives. Do you have any words of wisdom for walking the line between being vigilant and paralyzed with paranoia and fear?
Yeah, great question. And first, I always want to say, because I find the people where it's like former intimate partner, there's something different. For me, it's very easy to be like, well, I didn't know this person, whatever. And it seems to be there's so much, you know, like self-blame. And I always say, if your friend came to you and told you the situation, you would never judge them for it, right? So definitely go easy on yourself because you're already going through the hardest thing. You don't need to make it harder. But as far as walking a line between, you know, hypervigilance, I talk about this with all my survivor friends. Even when you go out to dinner, like it's like who's going to have the seat that's facing looking out, right? It's always something that you carry with you. And I find for me, like I always have a dog with me.
Mm.
Like we all have different things. It's all for us to find what it is that's therapeutic for us. But I think if you can empower yourself by learning as much, risk minimization, like I know I've done everything I can do. Now I have to live my life. That's how I get through it. But again, and it's hard too, because I have the additional difficulty where people are coming to me, seeking counsel and wanting help. And I might have been in a crisis that day myself because my situation is flared up. And so they look at me and they go, I want to be safe like you. And then I have to be like, well, I am sometimes, but again, it's just knowing that you've been as informed as possible. You've done all the things, and then kind of making peace with it and there is a balance between, hypervigilance and a feeling of peace. It does exist, but it's something we have to work on, and it doesn't come easily. And I love therapy. Therapy's great. Yeah.
Yes. Well, and the advice you gave that you just do whatever risk minimization you
Yes.
possibly can, and then you're done. Like you can't do more. I'm thinking about everyday things that I do, right? So my nails are always very short. I don't wear jewelry. I'm always ready to fight. I always have a weapon nearby or on my person, just always. And it reduces stress because I know I can't do anything else. That's the max I can do. What weird things we normalize, really weird things. Becca is asking, she says, thank you for your time and story. Your insight is invaluable. My question is, what does entertainment media get wrong about stalking, and how can we advocate for better representations of stalking and stalking survivors?
Yeah, that's everything. I actually have a company, Lenora Consulting, which is created for the sole purpose of better storytelling, more ethical storytelling, and giving victim survivors some agency in telling their story. And we also work as consultants. Like I reached out to Netflix and I was like, please let me be a consultant on you. They didn't go for it, but I tried. If there's a show about stalking, I'm probably on it. And the majority of them are celebrity cases. And you would believe that it was just happening to celebrities, which is not a fact. They also really, and again, both of ours are strangers, but we're in the minority. They really don't. And then the other thing too, I actually think that the title of true crime it's deeply offensive because it's not true. If we're really, like Indigenous women are largely stalked. You never hear their stories.
Right.
It's a lot of BIPOC. So it's not true. It's just, you see attractive white women with a twist. That's what the media would make you think is what's happening. And that is not a reflection of what's really happening. So, and also they never get the emotional impact. Like I can tell you, when I've had so many bad experiences on the show, which is weird because I'm a producer as well, which is why I had to start my company, because I'm like, I know how the sausage is made. We can do better. And I've had shows where I'm telling my story, and because I'm pretty far into my journey, and because I'm empowered, and because I've been so lucky as to be able to help people, I'm in a different place than I was in the very beginning, where I was just hysterical, right? I'm on a different part. And I've had producers look me in the eye and say, we know you've told your story so many times, but can you, and they try to force me to cry. They try to force a narrative that's not accurate. I've also on shows, I've had them where they try to have me do my own recreations, which can make you disassociate when you're asked to recreate your trauma for dramatic purposes. So yeah, not really a fan with the way a lot of the storytelling is done. I think we can do better. You never hear the emotional impact of stalking. You never hear that. Things like, we all have stomach problems. I mean, not every, but like a lot of us do. All the things that we know, that you never see that. You never see that element. You don't, the financial part, you don't hear about that. The impact, you just don't. What it's like to date when you're being stalked, what it's like to date afterwards. These are conversations that are so important we never see.
No trust. Yeah, all of the issues that come up. Ms. K has more of a comment, and I'll paraphrase because it's pretty long, but they write, please don't pardon the inadequate patriarchy and slave catcher culture, law enforcement gangs who've driven these behaviors and pandemics for centuries. Police officers and detectives are notorious for being coercive, control, narcissistic, domestic and sexual abusers and psychopaths, or any of the narcissism-based cluster B or antisocial personality disorders. And they go on to talk about Indigenous folks who are disproportionately affected by this, and how, journalists and others really should have been talking about this. Starting in the 70s and 80s, we knew about it, and yet we weren't talking about it. So bringing up all of those questions of bias and why it is that we don't treat this like a real crime, and the fact that it's disproportionately affecting already marginalized women, which I think is an important point to make. And then there are two questions that actually fit together. Rose writes, less of a question than an observation, but it is wild Not surprising, but wild that the VAWA crimes, Violence Against Women Act crimes, would be considered nonviolent offenses under that law. And then an anonymous attendee asks, any advice on how to get charges raised to a felony? I'm being stalked by a former student who believes we've been married for 30 years. My school did not charge the stalker with stalking. The school charged the stalker with a misdemeanor instead.
Well, if it's in California, it's really difficult right now. Like I talked to one of the stalking prosecutors who said about in LA County, like 400 cases come in, only 200 get to move forward. So 50% are being denied. A lot of them are I mean, mine was kicked down and I've already had a felony. So, again, it really, it's okay. I'm going to give a story about evidence that it like really illustrates it. So when we were getting ready to have what should have been my trial, had it not have been a plea deal, right? I remember we were going over the threats and what could be used and what could not be used. And I remember my prosecutor saying to me, so my stalker, one of his repeat fantasies, I'm Jewish, I'm Ashkenazi, and a lot of my relatives died in the Holocaust, right? So one of his fantasies is he, wants to rape me and then kill me with Zyklon B, which was probably used to kill my relatives, right? That's a very specific fantasy. And my prosecutor said to me, well, how would somebody get Zyklon B? Like that, it doesn't. And I'm just like, well, he could use some other kind of gas. Like at that point, my apartment, like anybody could have gassed with it. It was right out the street. I had like no protection. But I remember him saying to me, but the rape threats, we can enter those. And I remember him saying, because I do believe his penis could be a weapon. So a lot of it has to do with the language, which is like such a weird, again, it always comes down to these weird things with the threat code. So I don't know the person who asked that question. I don't know where they are. So it's kind of hard for me to answer that because, states vary and the criteria and the prosecutors, what they're willing to take on varies. I hate to say it, but so frequently it's like, just wait a minute, they'll tell on themselves. If you just keep, like, a lot of times prosecutors even wait before, like, they'll keep you pending for so long. And a lot of them are not great with communication, but the reason why they're doing it is because they're waiting for more evidence to come in because they're going to keep at it. And that's what happened with mine. So, you may not have it at this moment, but don't give up. If this is happening, just keep on it. And it's very possible you will.
Thank you. And I will close with one last question since we have exhausted all of the incredible questions in the Q&A. I know I had asked you a question earlier about if someone is sitting in front of you and they're in a situation, but more broadly, the most common, as you've laid out, the most common victims of stalking are going to be folks who are, previous relationships or acquaintances. I think a big barrier is not knowing it's stalking or not thinking it's serious enough because we always downplay gender-based violence. Women especially will internalize ideas that it's not really a crime or it's not really a threat. So in the context of kind of not really viewing this as very serious, what advice do you have for people who are in this situation, but maybe not seeing it as the threat that it is?
Yeah. So I'm not making light of it, but one thing that I've seen so frequently, I call it the FBI helicopter, and Jess will know what I'm talking about. And the FBI helicopter is you have an individual who really is at risk, right? Maybe there's a history of strangulation or there's something about there that's really terrifying. And they're so scared that they're not addressing it because it's just too much. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have my FBI helicopter people where someone is just trash talking them on the internet. And then they're like, I need the FBI helicopter to save me. And I don't know why that happens, but definitely I so frequently see the people who are really at risk and it's just too much, but as far as I'm not articulating it well, but I really work based off of gut. And if you're feeling fear, it is real. And that's all you need to know. Right. And at that point, if your anxiety is not going away, this is a thing. This is a thing you have to, again, so frequently, especially as women, we're made to downplay our feelings. We're told that we're being hysterical. We're told that we're being right. And that's what goes back to this whole reasonable thing, right? If this is something for you where you do not feel okay, then it is a thing. And you need to start consulting with experts or doing whatever you need to do to put these sort of layers of safety for yourself.
It reminds me of Gavin DeBecker's book, The Gift of Fear. And he was working with Brooke Shields, I think maybe still, but for many, many years to protect her from stalkers, who makes precisely that point, right? Which is that as women, we've been socialized to make sure to downplay threat because we're supposed to be pleasing. And so even when we're in high threat situations, we downplay the threat, we ignore our gut. So listening to your gut and taking it seriously. And so if you're listening to your gut and you're taking it seriously, what would the very next step be? Would it be to go to law enforcement?
I mean, if you have enough evidence, because honestly, that depends on what's happening, and that's really hard for me to answer without being able to like properly assess the situation. But definitely minimizing your risk. If they don't know where you live, wipe your address. If they do know where you live, install the cameras, like all of that stuff. Because in order for law enforcement to act, they really do need a lot of evidence. So it's almost like disheartening for somebody to go before they have all of that. So start collecting your evidence. It's really helpful also with law enforcement. Again, I've had a complicated relationship, but one of the things that was effective for me was that I was really organized with bringing my evidence, and kind of like one-sheeting it. And a timeline is really a great thing too, because, and this also is helpful for getting restraining orders, like showing the escalation, right, is really, really beneficial, because especially with a restraining order, you need the why now element. And sometimes, and I've seen this is another thing, is we could talk about restraining orders all day too. And maybe that's a separate thing, because I got a lot to say about that. But I've seen judges who maybe aren't the most informed or whatever. I've seen them where maybe somebody's having an issue with an individual over a long period of time, right? So for them, it's been 5 years. And so they go in kind of coming from a place that's logical to them in court going, well, I've had this problem with this individual for 5 years, but the judge might be hearing 5 years, they haven't done it yet, right? Which is crazy, but that is a thing. So you really need that why now and a timeline, again, showing the escalation. And it could be something as simple as you're in a new relationship and this person is jealous and that's triggering to them. And maybe that's the why now, or maybe they're posting, photos of them at a gun range on their Instagram. Like you need that. You need to show the timeline, to show the escalation, especially if you're trying to take it to law enforcement. They really
document and go to law enforcement.
Yeah. But again, but also let's also reel it back too. There's a lot of communities that are not comfortable with law enforcement at all. And we have to really honor that too. And in those situations, then that's a whole other thing. And that is something that we're, having to be realistic about as well.
So go to resources in the community. There are, as you mentioned, Spark, great resources.
Yeah.
Well, it's
Spark has a risk assessment tool. I just want to say that real quick. They do, that's really helpful, where you can kind of figure out if you're questioning, you just kind of put it into the computer, and it's a great sort of starting place to figure out what level of risk you may be under.
Because of our socialization, we're not good at gauging that, right? So it could be an assessment of whether or not, we probably think we're overreacting, and then we get into it. It's like, well, no, I'm not overreacting. I just did this threat assessment and it's telling me this. So excellent. Okay. So we will make sure to include all of those resources. And Anonymous says, thank you for this talk. Both awesome. I assume, of course, they're talking about Harvey Milk, who just jumped down. So kitten and dog therapy. And I am going to grab Baldwin. Just 1 second. You've got your dog. I'm going to grab another little kitty so we can sign off with some therapy creatures after discussing such incredibly difficult content. Lenora, you are amazing. Thank you so much for your work and your advocacy and for being a human shield. I know you said in the courtroom, but you're a human shield in society for stalking victims. So thank you so much for your work. And where can folks follow you?
Yeah, I mean, it's just, and also I want to say right back at you, it was like so amazing when I got to meet you, because that's another thing too. The need for community is everything. So I'm so grateful for your friendship and for you giving me this platform today. People can find me, just my name, Lenora Claire. I'm on most social media. I haven't done TikTok yet. I'm on everything, but on Twitter. I'm not on Twitter, too much for me. But you just find me, Lenora Claire, on most things, and I'll always answer every email. So please reach out if you have a question.
Thank you, you incredible human being.
Oh, thank you.
Much love to you. And thank you all for joining us today for this enlightening conversation. I know I learned a lot. I'm sure you did as well. Take care, be kind and gentle with yourselves. And if you have any therapy creatures, please go give them a hug. Bye, y'all.